What if the most proper woman in Hollywood wasn't so proper after all? For decades, Julie Andrews has been the picture of grace, elegance, and perfection. She was Mary Poppins, she was Maria, she was the sweet, wholesome star who defined an entire era of movies. But behind that polished smile and that flawless singing voice was a woman carrying secrets, heartbreak, and bold choices that stunned everyone who thought they knew her. From a childhood filled with shocking family revelations, to the moment her voice was destroyed forever, to a topless scene that shattered her perfect image, Julie Andrews has lived a life far more dramatic than any role she ever played on screen. And even now, at 89 years old, she's still surprising fans with confessions no one ever expected. This is the real story of Julie Andrews, the side that's rarely been told. Julia Elizabeth Wells was born on October 1, 1935, in Walton-on-Thames, England, and from the very beginning her life was shaped by contradictions. On one hand, she had a gift so extraordinary that people compared her voice to something supernatural. On the other, she grew up in an unstable home filled with secrets, dysfunction, and responsibilities no child should ever have to carry. Her parents were both school teachers, but her mother Barbara abandoned her marriage during the war to live with Canadian tenor Ted Andrews. Though Ted was not her biological father, Julie took his name and grew up believing he was the man who had raised her. Her childhood home, however, was far from the kind of happy, orderly setting she would one day portray on screen. Both her mother and Ted drank heavily, and while music was a constant in the house, so was tension. What made Julie stand out was her voice. By the age of 8, people were astonished at her natural range and power. She had a 4-octave singing voice, something so rare it immediately drew attention. At just 9 years old, her mother and Ted placed her on stage as part of their vaudeville act. She was so small she had to stand on a beer crate just to reach the microphone, belting out songs to smoky halls filled with strangers, while most girls her age were still learning multiplication tables. Her gift became the family's lifeline. She wasn't just a child with a hobby, she was the breadwinner. Money she earned from her performances helped put food on the table, and by her early teens was enough to buy her family a home. But that responsibility came at a price. Her education was pushed aside. She didn't have the luxury of carefree childhood friendships, games, or school dances. Her job was to sing, perform, and keep her family afloat. And as if the pressure of being the provider wasn't enough, Julie also had to live with a dark and unsettling reality at home. In her memoir, she revealed that Ted Andrews, when drunk, would attempt to enter her room at night. Terrified, she installed a lock on her door to protect herself, an act of survival that no child should ever have to consider. These experiences forced her to grow up long before her time, shaping the strength and quiet resilience that fans would later admire in her characters. As she matured, another devastating truth came crashing down. At 15, Julie discovered that Ted Andrews wasn't her biological father at all. Her real father was a family friend her mother had been romantically involved with during the war. For a girl who had already endured so much, the revelation was both disorienting and painful. Yet, through it all, she kept performing. Singing wasn't just a career for Julie, it was her escape, her way to carve out an identity that wasn't defined by the chaos of her household. By the age of 12, she was singing for King George VI at the Royal Command performance, her crystal-clear voice filling the hall and leaving audiences speechless. At 13, she made her West End debut in the show Starlight Roof. The child who had once stood on a beer crate was now standing in some of the grandest theaters in the world, commanding stages with ease. What's astonishing is that through the struggles of her early life, Julie's talent only grew sharper. Every hardship seemed to push her further, giving her the discipline and toughness that would later carry her to Broadway and eventually Hollywood. But those early years never left her. She carried the scars of her childhood, both emotional and physical, long after she became famous. The polished, graceful Julie Andrews the world adored was built on a foundation of grit, pain, and survival. And while audiences believed she was practically perfect, she knew better than anyone that perfection was an illusion. As she stepped into her teenage years and her career began to accelerate, Julie was about to trade the turbulence of her childhood for a whole new kind of whirlwind, the relentless climb to international stardom. And with it would come betrayal, opportunity, and a role that would change her life forever. By the early 1950s, Julie Andrews was no longer just a precocious child singer. She was being recognized as one of the brightest young talents in England. At 19, she was cast in a major West End production, and within a few short years, she was whisked across the Atlantic to Broadway. In 1954, she made her New York debut in The Boyfriend, a frothy musical comedy that immediately captured critics' attention. But it was her performance 2 years later in My Fair Lady that truly catapulted her into stardom. Playing Eliza Doolittle opposite Rex Harrison, Julie embodied both the rough Cockney flower girl and the polished society woman with charm, wit, and a voice that stunned audiences night after night. The show was a smash hit and turned her into a Broadway star. But when Hollywood came calling to adapt My Fair Lady into a film, Julie was shocked to learn that she would not be reprising her iconic role. The studio executives decided she wasn't famous enough to carry a big-budget movie and cast Audrey Hepburn instead. It was a painful rejection that could have stalled her career. What Julie didn't know was that someone else had been watching her closely. Walt Disney himself had seen her on stage and believed she was the perfect choice for a project he was developing, Mary Poppins. Despite being overlooked for My Fair Lady, she suddenly found herself being courted by Disney. At first, she hesitated because she was pregnant with her daughter Emma, but Walt personally assured her they would wait until after she gave birth to begin filming. That vote of confidence would change her life forever. When Mary Poppins premiered in 1964, it was an immediate sensation. Julie's mix of sternness, warmth, and effortless singing enchanted audiences of all ages. Critics praised her screen presence, and to top it all off, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress. Her very first film role had earned her Hollywood's most prestigious honor. The irony wasn't lost on her. Audrey Hepburn had played Eliza Doolittle on screen, but it was Julie who walked away with the Oscar. The very next year, she starred in The Sound of Music, and the world was once again captivated. Playing Maria, the spirited governess who brings joy back into a grieving family's life, Julie cemented her image as the wholesome heroine of the 1960s. The movie became one of the highest-grossing films of all time, and her portrayal of Maria became one of the most beloved performances in cinema history. But what audiences didn't see was the grueling reality behind the camera. The opening shot of her twirling in the Austrian Alps, now one of the most iconic images in film, was a nightmare to shoot. A helicopter had to fly dangerously low to capture the shot, and the force of its rotor blades kept knocking her flat on the ground. She had to haul herself back up and try again, 9 times in total, until the director finally had enough footage. There were other mishaps too. When the studio decided her hair should be lighter, the first attempt at dyeing it left her with a shocking bright orange mess. In the end, they had to cut it short and bleach it, giving her the cropped blonde look that became part of Maria's signature appearance. Despite the behind-the-scenes struggles, Julie's performance in The Sound of Music cemented her reputation worldwide. She had become a symbol of grace, purity, and perfection, almost too good to be true. What few people realized was that this perfect image was already starting to feel like a cage. Julie knew that if she kept playing prim and proper roles, she would forever be typecast as Hollywood's squeaky-clean darling. Even the costumes of Mary Poppins held a secret clue to her desire to break free. Designed by her first husband, Tony Walton, the outfits appeared proper on the outside, but the linings and underskirts were made in bright, playful colors, hidden flashes of rebellion that only Julie knew about. For her, it was a private reminder that beneath the prim exterior she was still cheeky, fun, and full of mischief. Audiences, however, continued to see only the perfect nanny or the angelic governess. She was practically perfect in every way, at least on screen. But Julie Andrews was not content to stay locked in that image forever. She wanted to show the world that she wasn't just a saintly voice on a mountaintop. She was human, funny, flawed, and capable of surprising everyone who thought they had her figured out. And soon enough, she would prove it in ways that shocked even Walt Disney himself. The public saw Julie Andrews as the epitome of poise and perfection, but those who worked with her quickly learned she had a cheeky, unfiltered side that was impossible to ignore. One of the most surprising stories comes from the set of Mary Poppins, where Julie was strapped into a wire rig for a flying stunt. Instead of floating gracefully, the harness malfunctioned and she came crashing down, hitting the stage with a painful thud. In that moment of shock and frustration, Julie let out a string of curse words loud enough to make the crew freeze. Standing nearby was none other than Walt Disney himself, the man whose name was synonymous with family-friendly entertainment. Julie later joked that she was certain Uncle Walt had never heard words like that before. For audiences who believed she was practically perfect, the idea of Mary Poppins swearing like a sailor was unthinkable. But for Julie, it was just real life slipping through the cracks of her image. That wasn't the only time her behavior startled those around her. Corinne Dautris, the child actress who played Jane Banks, recalled being stunned when she wandered onto set one day and found Julie, still dressed head to toe in her prim Mary Poppins costume, puffing on a cigarette and swearing casually as she chatted with the crew. For 8-year-old Corinne, it was a surreal sight, Mary Poppins, hat, gloves, and all, breaking the illusion with every puff of smoke. But for Julie, it was never about being rebellious for the sake of shock. It was about balance. She was fully aware of the saintly image the public projected onto her, and she took a quiet pleasure in subverting it. She knew the contrast between her on-screen roles and her off-screen personality made her more human, more relatable, and in some ways, even more intriguing. Julie herself admitted in interviews that she enjoyed surprising people with her humor. She once quipped, "Does Mary Poppins go to the bathroom? I assure you she does." It was her way of reminding the world that no matter how perfect her characters seemed, she was still a flesh and blood woman with flaws, quirks, and a mischievous streak. That playfulness followed her into new roles as she moved away from musicals and into more serious projects. When she starred in the Americanization of Emily in 1964, she was faced with something she had never done before, an on-screen love scene. At 28, Julie had spent most of her career playing wholesome characters untouched by romance or passion. Now she was expected to portray a war widow falling for a charming American officer played by James Garner. For someone who had little romantic experience herself, it was terrifying. She confessed in her memoir that she had no idea what was expected of her. How exactly was she supposed to kiss? How far was the scene supposed to go? With cameras rolling, crew members watching, and the pressure of her blossoming film career on her shoulders, Julie felt completely out of her depth. But James Garner turned out to be the perfect partner for her first romantic scene. Charming, respectful, and easygoing, he went out of his way to make her feel safe and comfortable. Julie later described him as delicious and credited his kindness for helping her through the moment. Even so, she was not prepared for the wave of emotion that overtook her during filming. When the scene ended and she tried to walk away, her legs gave out beneath her. She was literally weak at the knees, overwhelmed not just by the physical closeness, but by the emotional intensity of stepping into new territory. That vulnerability revealed a side of Julie Andrews few had ever seen before, the side that was willing to step outside of her comfort zone and risk shattering the pristine image audiences had of her. For Julie, these moments, whether swearing in front of Walt Disney, smoking in costume, or melting into James Garner's arms, were proof that she was not the flawless icon the world imagined. She was far more complex, a woman who lived in the tension between her public image and her private truth. And as the 1970s and 80s rolled around, Julie would take that complexity to shocking new heights by doing something no one believed she was capable of, stripping away her squeaky clean persona, quite literally, in a role that stunned the world. By the early 1980s, Julie Andrews had spent nearly 2 decades as Hollywood's beloved good girl, the star who embodied purity, grace, and old-fashioned charm. She had won an Oscar, conquered Broadway, and become immortalized in The Sound of Music. But with every passing year, she felt more trapped by that perfect image. Audiences loved her as Mary Poppins and Maria, but the industry seemed unwilling to let her be anything else. Julie wanted to break free, to show she was more than a sweet nanny with a magic umbrella. The opportunity came in 1981 with S.O.B., a dark Hollywood satire directed by her husband Blake Edwards. The film mocked the industry's obsession with image, sex appeal, and box office success. Edwards cast Julie in the role of a squeaky clean actress, clearly modeled on her real-life persona, who is persuaded to take part in a racy remake of a failing movie. For the first time in her career, Julie Andrews appeared topless on screen. The decision was explosive. Fans who had grown up watching her sing "Do Re Mi" on Austrian hillsides were stunned to see her in such a provocative scene. The wholesome nanny who had tucked children into bed was now barring it all for the world to see. Some praised her bravery, admiring the way she shattered her typecast image. Others accused her of destroying the family-friendly reputation she had built. Newspapers ran headlines calling it the end of innocence. Julie, however, was entirely unapologetic. She knew exactly what she was doing and why. In interviews, she explained that she wanted to prove she was more than just a one-dimensional figure in Hollywood's golden musicals. When reporters pressed her on the drastic change, she responded with her trademark wit, asking, "Does Mary Poppins have an orgasm?" It was her sharp, humorous way of reminding everyone that her characters were not her real self, and that she was a woman with depth, passion, and agency. For Julie, the role was empowering. She trusted Blake to handle the material with care, and together they leaned into the controversy rather than shying away from it. The topless scene became one of the most talked-about moments of her career, and while it shocked some longtime fans, it also forced Hollywood to see her in a new light. No longer could she be confined to sugar-sweet roles. She had proved she was daring, versatile, and willing to take risks that most would never expect from her. The move was risky, but it paid off in unexpected ways. In the years that followed, she continued to collaborate with Blake Edwards on films like Victor Victoria, where she pushed boundaries again by playing a woman pretending to be a man performing as a woman. Each project gave her the chance to flex her comedic, dramatic, and musical talents in ways that defied expectations. Looking back, that topless moment in SOB was more than just a headline grabber. It was a declaration of independence. Julie Andrews was no longer content to be Hollywood's angel. She was ready to be real, raw, and even shocking. Yet as bold as her reinvention was, her greatest challenge was still ahead. Because in the late 1990s, Julie would face a devastating blow that threatened not just her image, but the very thing that had defined her life since childhood, her voice. For someone whose life and identity had been built around her extraordinary voice, losing it was unthinkable. Yet in 1997, that nightmare became reality for Julie Andrews. After decades of singing on stages and in films, she developed non-cancerous nodules on her vocal cords. Doctors assured her that a simple surgery would correct the problem and allow her to sing again. Instead, the operation left her vocal cords permanently scarred. The voice that had carried her from smoky music halls as a child to the world's most prestigious stages was gone in an instant. For Julie, it was devastating. Singing had not just been her career, it had been her lifeline since childhood, a way to survive her turbulent home and later the engine of her success. Now the one gift that had carried her through everything was silenced. She described the aftermath as one of the darkest times of her life. There were tears, anger, and even a lawsuit against the doctors, which was eventually settled out of court. Many fans assumed her career was finished, but Julie Andrews refused to let the loss of her singing voice define the rest of her life. Instead, she reinvented herself in ways that surprised even those closest to her. First, she leaned into acting and narration. Her rich speaking voice, still warm and expressive, opened new opportunities. In 2001, she charmed a new generation as Queen Clarice Rinaldi in The Princess Diaries, reminding audiences of her regal grace. She also lent her voice to animation, most notably as Queen Lillian in the Shrek films, proving she could still command attention even without singing a single note. At the same time, Julie found a new outlet for her creativity in writing. She began co-authoring children's books with her daughter Emma Walton Hamilton, establishing the Julie Andrews Collection. Their stories were heartfelt, whimsical, and often carried quiet lessons about resilience, courage, and kindness, qualities that reflected her own life. Writing became both therapy and a new career, one that allowed her to inspire younger generations in a completely different way. She also embraced opportunities as a memoirist. In her books Home and Homework, she finally peeled back the layers of her life, sharing candid truths about her difficult childhood, her struggles in Hollywood, and her private battles that fans had never known about. Far from clinging to the perfect image of her early career, Julie chose honesty, vulnerability, and humor. The world learned that Mary Poppins wasn't quite as prim as she seemed. Recognition soon followed. She received Lifetime Achievement Awards, honors from the American Film Institute, and tributes celebrating her legacy. But for Julie, the real achievement was that she had managed to create a second act for herself after what could have been the end. Where many stars would have faded, she adapted. She refused to be defined by loss. Instead, she became an example of resilience, proving that even when life takes away the very thing you thought you couldn't live without, there are always new ways to shine. Still, as inspiring as her reinvention was, Julie's personal life during these years was just as full of love, heartbreak, and resilience. Behind the awards and reinventions was a marriage that defined her adult life, children who grounded her, and the painful loss of the man she called the love of her life. Julie Andrews' personal life was as layered and dramatic as any role she ever played on screen, marked by deep love, profound loss, and surprising revelations that continued well into her later years. Her first marriage, to set and costume designer Tony Walton in 1959, was a union of youthful creativity. Tony even designed the costumes for Mary Poppins, leaving his fingerprints on the very film that defined her early career. Together, they had a daughter, Emma, but as Julie's fame skyrocketed and Tony's career demands pulled him in different directions, their marriage began to strain. By 1967, they divorced, though they remained supportive of each other as co-parents. Not long after, fate led Julie to the man who would become her life partner, director Blake Edwards. Their first meeting was anything but romantic, a chance encounter as they passed each other's cars outside a therapist's office, but something clicked. They married in 1969, and their bond endured for more than 4 decades. Their relationship was far from simple. Blake battled chronic health problems and struggled with depression, while Julie often found herself taking on the role of caretaker. Yet their marriage thrived on creativity, humor, and resilience. Blake directed several of her films, including SOB and Victor Victoria, where Julie reinvented herself yet again with bold performances. Together, they built a blended family, raising Julie's daughter Emma alongside Blake's 2 children from a previous marriage, and later adopting 2 Vietnamese girls, Amy and Joanna, during the 1970s. For Julie, family life was never traditional, but it was rich with love. She often said that raising her children was the role she cherished most, even more than any she played on stage or screen. The stability of her home life helped anchor her through the turbulence of Hollywood, especially as her career transformed in the years after she lost her voice. But in 2010, Julie's world was shattered when Blake Edwards passed away from pneumonia after a long decline in health. Julie, who had stood by his side through every battle, admitted she felt lost without him. She described his death as a hole in her life that could never truly be filled. Yet even in grief, she showed the same resilience that had defined her from childhood. Surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she carried on, finding new meaning in writing, narration, and advocacy work. What makes Julie Andrews remarkable is not just her talent, but her honesty. In her later memoirs, she chose not to preserve the perfect image audiences once believed in, but to reveal herself as a woman who endured trauma, heartbreak, and reinvention. She spoke candidly about the pain of her childhood, the challenges of fame, the loss of her singing voice, and even the cheeky humor that made her laugh in the darkest of times. At 89 years old, she remains a living legend, not just because of the roles she played, but because of the resilience she displayed when the spotlight dimmed. She is proof that perfection is a myth and that true strength lies in vulnerability. Fans who grew up believing Julie Andrews was practically perfect have since learned the truth. She is far more interesting than perfection ever could be. And in many ways, that's the greatest role she has ever played. Not the nanny who floated in on an umbrella, not the nun who sang on mountaintops, but the woman who faced every storm in her life with courage, humor, and a refusal to give up.